And that comes back to the earlier points you're making around trust in machines, which do tend to flatten a whole lot of nuance towards a consensus of sort. And consensus can be dangerous if consensus ends up being wrong. So I think a lot of these sort of conversations come together. I think the bottom line is policy making is really, really difficult. And that's why in general, when in doubt, doing nothing is quite often the best choice of action.
How do we as individuals reclaim our personal agency in the face of rapid technological change and economic and political disruption? Well, that is a question that Bronwyn Williams has been thinking carefully about. She is the host of the Small Print podcast on the Discourse ZA channel. Bronwyn Williams, welcome to Solutions with David Ansara. In the spirit of your podcast, please introduce yourself to our audience in the way that you would like to introduce yourself.
That is my line. You have done your homework. But basically what I am is, in reality, a court jester for hire. So with my company Flux Trends, my business partner and I, that's Leon Chang and myself, essentially go around rattling the cages of corporate South Africa. And occasionally we also invite it into the more hallowed halls of the public sector too, to essentially talk truth to power and to tell people what's going on outside of their primary domain of expertise. And that's the gap we fill. So you can kind of see us as being either that court jester type figure and or the modern contemporary version of the watchman on the watchtower, kind of scanning the horizon for the marauding hordes and seeing what's coming next and why that's going to matter to you and to your business.
Okay, so most CEOs have their nose to the grindstone, but I suppose you help them to cast their eyes to the hills to see what's coming.
Yes, exactly. So whatever business you're in, you should, at least you really should, know what's going on inside your own organization and inside your own industry more than we would be able to know about that as professional outsiders. But that professional outsider role does allow us the luxury to see what's going elsewhere in the world in different sectors, in different industries that you might not have noticed because it's not close to your individual domain of expertise, but still could have a really important impact on what you're doing in the future of your organization. And quite often we also talk to leaders in their personal capacity too, because we're all individual human beings at the end of the day. We all live and die one day and all the rest of it. And a lot of the things that we're tracking do matter on a personal level. And a lot of the trends that we're seeing right now, which I think you alluded to a bit earlier, also relates to our personal value systems and the fundamental meaning of life and of society and of community, which is why it's a very strange place to be in, this sort of professional outsider role right now, looking at what's going on in the world and trying to make it make sense to people, but in a way that doesn't do away with the concept of agency, which is a critical thing that we're seeing falling apart. It's one of those big trends that's cutting through everything. On the one hand, you see agency being taken away, but on the other hand, we're also seeing agency being given away by people who just seem completely overwhelmed with change. And a lot of these changes are really big and they're outside of what we think we can do anything about. But when you get right down to it, we do still have agency if we choose not to give it away. So those are the sort of conversations we're having at the moment. And I'm sure that has shed absolutely no light on who I am and what I do, but that's what I wanted to say, so I said it.
Okay, well, let's explore this concept of agency because I think that that's quite interesting. So in what ways are people having more agency and in what ways is their agency diminishing?
Well, that's the point. People are having less agency, but some of this is like a demand issue and some of it's a supply issue, right? So on the one hand, you've got really, we're seeing macro trends at a global level, also at a local level here in South Africa. Government is getting bigger, right? We have more rules, not less rules. And I think it's only fair to say that a lot of people like the fact that we have more rules. More rules, at least in theory, do give us more safety in a physical sense. But government is getting bigger. We're having to consider even what we say, even on platforms like this, like censorship is becoming a greater and greater topic, quite ironically, of discussion right now. What should we be allowed to say? What should we be allowed to do? We're seeing laws being made that are becoming more and more subjective and less objective, which means that, yes, agency is being diminished. we are being encouraged to self-censor ourselves, even if where there are no rules in place, by the sort of gentle nudging of what I'm terming the trend towards skeleton key laws. And skeleton key laws are sort of like a skeleton key in a movie or in an old house that can unlock lots of doors or lock lots of doors too. A sort of master key legislation that is based on subjective measures rather than objective measures, where factors like censorship are making their way into laws. And we're seeing a lot of this, right? And that does mean that we're encouraged then to self-censor ourselves, and self-censoring ourselves becomes more of a case of us giving up agency voluntarily, and also encouraging us to sort of police those around us, even when we're not forced to do so. So there's a sort of sense of actually wanting to have less choice, but also from a demand side, being in the privileged position in this point in time in society right now, where most of us actually have an overabundance, or have had until quite recently, an overabundance of choice, an overabundance of access to resources, of access to information. It can make us feel quite overwhelmed, and as such, choice becomes a bit of a curse, and agency is tied up very closely with the concept of free will and choice and all the rest of it. And when that choice, using that agency becomes overwhelming, we do look for ways to defer that right and that responsibility, that is agency, that is exercising choice, to other entities, whether those entities be authority figures in the very human realm, or whether increasingly those entities do become entities like artificial intelligence and technology that allow us to not have to make choices for ourselves. And we're doing this for reasons of convenience and for feeling overwhelmed, but also for reasons of fear, which is quite reasonable. Many of us are scared of making the wrong choices about our own health and about our own wealth because the consequences are vast, but also perhaps slightly more disturbingly, we also have a bit of envy creeping into the society there too. Like, I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with the concept of FOMO, which is quite a pop culture term, but it speaks quite deeply into actual human psyche and the fact that we don't like to see other people succeeding where we have made bad choices. And one of the ways that we can actually mitigate our envy response is by limiting not just our own choices, by delegating our own choices to a synthetic or a human authority figure, but also by limiting the choices around us. So we never have to be confronted by the consequences of ourselves making a wrong choice. So if we are faced as individuals with the choice of taking path A or taking path B, there's a risk that by choosing to take path A, when other people take path B, they end up at a nicer destination than we ourselves ended up. So one of the ways we can guard ourselves against feeling envious in the future is by actually shutting off path B to everyone, so that everybody is forced to make the same choice that we made. And that becomes even more quite depressing if you get into this sort of story of agency and choice reduction, when that choice is now not just being made by some people and forcing everyone else to join them, but it's actually being made by an outsourced authority, by a human authority, or increasingly by a piece of code that nudges more and more of us towards a particular points of view, a particular destination in cyberspace or in real space, and so on and so on. So anyway, this conversation around agency is being attacked by many different degrees, and it gets perhaps to its more sort of futuristic endpoint when we start to see those sort of programmed choices, or that central authority making the choice on behalf of many individuals or a group being codified into sort of self-healing law, for example. So like the whole conversation around DAOs plays into this. That'll be decentralized autonomous organizations, which is sort of out in the crypto world around sort of like coordinating over how to buy. There was like the constitutional DAO that I think a lot of people heard about, where a bunch of like crypto guys got together and tried to buy a copy of the US Constitution. It failed in quite a spectacular format, which made a lot of people roll their eyes about the whole world of crypto. But those sorts of noisy stories kind of distract the conversation. So what's really going on in the world of this decentralized idea is also a lot about giving up some of our agency, as much as a lot of the conversation around crypto tends to be about reclaiming personal sovereignty and agency. The same technologies can actually be used to do kind of the opposite, to actually automate away not just conflict and trust between people, but can also be used to automate away agency and choice making, because they allow us to automate decisions in the form of smart contracts that are governed by a consensus of people bought into that system. And as such, we are able to defer sometimes a lot of our choice, even as it's being presented to us in a way of actually enhancing our choice. So anyway, whether you're looking at technology, coming at from many different angles, from social pressures, from economic pressures, technological pressures, we definitely are seeing that agency is being diminished. But critically, for anyone that leans towards the more libertarian viewpoint, a lot of this relinquishing of agency is being done voluntarily by people who are afraid, are experiencing FOMO, or are just quite simply overwhelmed by the choices available to them today.
Yeah, the opposite of FOMO is JOMO, the joy of missing out, which is something that I've been trying to embrace recently.
It's much healthier.
I think that what's quite interesting about what you were just saying is, I mean, I've been a strong proponent of decentralization on this podcast, and many of my guests have spoken about the virtues of spreading power and decision-making and agency down to the individual level rather than concentrating power. But I think you've flagged a potential risk as well, that this kind of automation, like you spoke about open ledgers or automated AI functions, that actually it does separate or diffuse power, but it also drains away agency. So I think that's an interesting contradiction that you're highlighting.
Yeah, everything is so full of contradictions, and particularly in the world of DeFi, which I do find fascinating because I've been quite close to it. And I think that initially you're very attracted to it because it matches your sort of personal political leanings, and it seems like this makes a lot of sense. But you always have to interrogate any technologies, because technology is not society. Technology is a tool, and technologies can be used in various different ways. I think you've got to be very, very careful about branding certain types of technologies as being morally good or bad, or politically useful or not, because they can all be used in very interesting ways. I think it's quite key to understand like the actual philosophy being built behind systems like DeFi and like using DAOs and using blockchains, all the rest of it. There's two things that it's trying to do. Firstly, it's trying to be, and it was literally there in the original literature, replace trust in people with trust in code. So they're deliberately building trustless systems. So already there's a few issues to challenge there. So you might think this is a great idea because it eliminates the ability for people to be corrupt and all the rest of it. But it also breaks down social ties. It replaces people with code and machines, which means that it will have a destabilizing effect on our ability to actually build human bridges in our communication and our connection. So these things always come with a give and a take. And even decentralization itself should not be confused with democratization, right? Because decentralization decentralizes power centers, but it makes no promises on decentralizing monetary power, for example, and it makes no promises on actually removing more powerful people from being outsized players in these networks. Rather, it removes centralized authority and centralized decision-making. But decentralization is a complicated concept, and it comes again with a whole lot of pros and a whole lot of cons. But I think the more interesting one to think about there, any sort of conversation that involves agency and the future of governance and technology, is again the limits of decentralization. And I always like to look at the borderlands, or at the margins and at the fray. And like this applies to economic policy too. Things that seem good at a first order effect tend to have quite interesting sort of unseen effects further down the line. And any question of decentralization has to really be focused on the borderlands, has to be focused on what gets into the system and what gets out of the system. It's really critical to understand with these sorts of technologies that trust within a system is not the same as trust in a system. And I think that's where a lot of these conversations, particularly relating to governance and agency, do tend to break down. That once information is in a DAO, in a blockchain, it is technically immutable, and it can be functioned in a sort of trustless environment. That information has to get into the system in the first place, which does involve some sort of weak points, and also has to get out at some point. And the same conversations can flow with regards to value and the utility of the various wonderful cryptocurrencies and things going on across the world. These ideas that do keep me up at night, so I like to sort of play with them and see the limits of our beautiful, perfect towers that we like to build. I think that the general lesson is that any human-based system is not a utopia, and utopia by definition is a place that doesn't exist, and that a lot of these things can push unintended consequences to the side. In fact, I think there's a lot of parallels with the DeFi conversation they are with the eco conversation, and a lot of the unseen effects happening in those systems on a very different side of the political playing field.
Okay, but I mean, if we look, for example, in areas such as finance, we've seen the perils of over-centralization, that central banks now have this disproportionate power to set monetary policy. We had Alex Gladstein on the show last week to discuss, just how monetary easing, quantitative easing has really eroded the value of currencies, particularly the US dollar, and now seeing inflation, etc. So, I mean, it seems to me that human beings are, as you say, subject to all sorts of, biases, or, they have ideological convictions, and trying to remove the human element from some of these institutions is actually a good thing. You're suggesting otherwise.
I'm not suggesting otherwise. Per se, it sounds great, right? It sounds great, like removing all the fallible human beings from our systems, and we'll have a much fairer playing field. But that's great in theory. Real life does tend to sort of spit in the face of theory. Like, what does Felina like to say? She likes to say that, like, every constructivist has a theory until they get kicked in the face by real politic. And I think the same sort of ideas do tend to play out in these systems too. It's great in theory, and there definitely are problems with the systems that we've built, the very centralized, very prone to be corrupted political and economic systems that we have across our countries. But we do need to then think about the limits of how technology can actually solve those fundamentally human problems. Because we're talking essentially about software problems here, not about hardware problems. It's about how we program our societies and the rules we choose to be governed by. And there is a danger from a political sort of futurist perspective in deferring all of our trust into trustless systems and machines. Again, it sounds wonderful on paper. We're cutting out all those corrupt politicians, all that graft, all those opportunities to inflate away real value from real people across the world with a really bad economic policy. But there's limits to code. And the biggest one is, of course, the garbage in, garbage out problem, right? And I have been writing and talking quite a lot recently about the concept of truth machines. What happens when these truth machines actually be used to launder lies and subjectivity into what is apparently immutable truth, but could actually be entirely false itself. I think that this is one of the challenges, and I do come at this as someone who is, it's important to say, I do lean towards the decentralization. I'm allergic to all forms of authority and being told what to do in my personal capacity, which is why I've spent a lot of time thinking about where I could be wrong, which is how I come to sort of think about these sorts of ideas. And this concept of garbage in, but a sort of manufactured truth out coming through in automated systems and blockchain-based systems, there is a real danger there. And this is the same danger that takes place in deferring our agency as individuals towards central authorities, and towards deferring our agency as individuals towards machines and technology, whether that machine is an artificial intelligence that's been put in place by an authority figure in your country, or whether that machine is a perfect blockchain from the inside out, but not necessarily from the outside going in. And we can start to see the dangers of these sorts of systems from a political perspective, once again, when we start to see what's going on across the world with the increasing move towards whatever you want to call it, forms of social credit scores, for example, where that credit score is now being used to limit your access, whether it's to finance, is what happens in the West. These are not like conspiracy theories, they're quite old ideas that if computer says no, if you're on the wrong side of the line, if your income doesn't match a certain level, then you're going to be denied that access to service. And we start rolling these out and get to slightly more dystopian points where those credit scores are compiled by your trustworthiness in society, which is quite ironic in a sort of conversation around trust, which is what China is leading towards, that your social trustworthiness score does limit your access to certain services and privileges within society. And that's well and good if you like perfectly fair systems. Again, you can see how on a very authoritarian basis and a very libertarian basis, the same conversations around replacing human beings and trust in people and individuals and making individual judgments with perfect code are being had in very different parts of the political spectrum. But the danger is when that code that is saying no, that is either affirming or denying your access to a particular service is based on bad information, or worse, on bad inferences, which is where we're heading to, where we are actually with data collection. Rather, the data that goes into these systems is not direct data, like this is what you said, this is what you did, this is what your blood pressure is, but rather it's inferred. People like you who did this are people like that. And when those sorts of decisions are being made by various different machines or technologies and used to limit your access to real goods and services and real privileges in life, there is a danger that the information that we're relying on there, that we have deemed to be true because it has been validated by a network, whether that's a decentralized network or a centralized network or a decentralized piece of code or a centralized government mandated piece of code, the same issue persists in that we can have false trust in a machine because we have given up trust in real people. And I've been watching interesting conversations there around the conversation around science versus the science and what's going on in the real world, where some older scientists are saying young people that are going to universities right now are refusing to believe the evidence of their own eyes because a peer-reviewed paper said otherwise. So in other words, these conversations around manufactured truth and turning truth into code or using code to verify truth, but without actually verifying the information that goes into that truth, are, I think, going to be the biggest sort of socio-political issue when it comes to ideas of consensus and consent and democracy and digital democracy going forward. Because what we're really talking about here is a sort of erosion of a common basis for what reality is as human beings. And because we're no longer able to agree, even quite literally, that 1 + 1 = 2. I mean, if you don't believe me, go check out those sort of conversations on social media and see how fast our perceived notions of reality unravel. The temptation is to replace those messy relationships with trust in immutable code. And again, this is taking place in the DeFi world, it's taking place in the very sort of authoritarian dictator world too, but it's the same logic that's getting us to this point of replacing trust in people. And that people, by the way, include ourselves, trust in human bodies and our own eyes, with trust in code. And I think that's a really interesting place where we're heading towards, because as soon as you open yourself up to those sorts of ideas, again, whether you're an authoritarian or a libertarian, it's not a very huge leap to get to the point where a lot of my futurist sort of colleagues are talking about, whereby we're already delegating our choice making over who we date, what we eat, what brand we're going to buy, to those helpful little bots and algorithms that sort of nudge us through the supermarket aisles. How much further before we start to allow those same sort of algorithms and bots and helpful technologies to help us decide who to vote for in a democracy, right? And like your cell phone knows, like everywhere all the articles you like and the people you like to speak to, and they can make a pretty good inference, surely, if they can recommend to you the person you're supposed to date or sleep with. Why can't those same helpful little algorithms tell you who you should be voting for based on who you are, right? I mean, and if we do agree to that, even if it's not compulsory, like we just allow the machine to start to recommend us in a certain direction, the next greatest sort of leap to say, oh, well, the machines know everything about everyone anyway, so why don't we just sort of infer the general consensus for what's going on? And suddenly we've manufactured consent where there was none, right? We manufactured consent out of consensus. I think these are really interesting points to be getting to. And you might think I'm talking completely crazy talk, but we are getting to a point where you've got AI ethicists and bioethicists publishing, again, peer-reviewed, so take it with a pinch of salt, papers talking about how it should actually be ethical to start to give people, against their consent, ethics enhancing drugs that will allow people to make quote unquote better choices, better moral choices. And you see how quickly that slippery slope sort of gets pulled out of our feet when we start to replace trust in individuals, again, including ourselves, with trust in technology, however well-intentioned. There are limits to what code can do to solve our social problems. That's not to say we shouldn't be using them, but it is important to interrogate these fringes and the way these things fray at the edges. And very similar conversations refer to what's going on with like bioethics in terms of genetic engineering and all the rest of it. And you start to get into pretty deep ethical and political waters quite fast when you start to interrogate what these systems mean when taken out of the world of commerce and rolled up to the world of politics and governance.
Okay, so the technology is neutral, but then you overlay that with human behavior, the quest for power, and things can get a little bit messy.
Always can, right? I mean, like you can use a spoon to eat ice cream, or you can use a spoon to turn it into a shank in prison, right? I mean, like these conversations like roll up, but the stakes roll up with them as you start to get to more and more powerful systems.
Yeah, and these things involve costs and benefits. They're not necessarily these utopian fix-alls.
No, the technology should never be a utopia. We should always understand that technology is there to help us, to guide us, to make things more efficient. And that's generally what technology does. It makes whatever we're doing more efficient. And whether those are naughty things or nice things, we can do them faster and more effectively. But we shouldn't confuse effectively with ethically, for example. And I think that's often a conversation we have with corporate clients, right? So I think these conversations do scale. They're quite fractal in that regard.
So Bronwyn, what do you think of this literature around nudging? If you consider the book by Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler, who went on to win a Nobel Prize, this idea of kind of controlling or presenting a choice architecture that helps people to make better decisions. Do you think that there's a risk of paternalism in that? They call themselves paternalistic libertarians. I think
libertarian paternalism, yeah, that's a complete oxymoron. There's no such thing. There's no such thing as like libertarian paternalism, because you're talking effectively about hacking people's agency to nudge someone towards a decision that is generally for the greater good and not necessarily for the best good of the individual concerned. I'll just sort of frame this conversation, since we're talking about framing. I'll just give you a pun there. But essentially, the people get the concept of nudging quite wrong, in that a nudge, by the definition of Sunstein et al. And all the people that have sort of been building into this behavioral economics literature, a nudge should not change the actual trade-off or the actual choice utility for the subject of the nudge. So in other words, if your choice is between having a packet of knickknacks and an apple for lunch, the nudge should not change the amount of calories that you're going to get from the chips or from the apple. The nudge, in the sort of the classic sense, or the behavioral economics literature sense, should simply change the framing. So in other words, increase the likelihood of you making a particular choice, but not actually change the actual effect of you choosing path A or path B. In which case, which is where the whole basis of the idea of libertarian paternalism came from. And yes, it is quite dangerous. Yes, it is something that with great power comes great responsibility and all the rest of it. But if you are a policymaker, you have to make choices for the good of your population, in which case having an opt-in versus an opt-out on your blood donor cards, that I don't think is an ethical infringement of anyone's rights, because the fact that people are more likely to remain opted in to, say, a blood drive system if opt-in is the default as opposed to opt-out being the default, I think that those choices are choices that policymakers have to make, and they are quite low cost at both the individual and the societal level, because there's no added cost to the individual for making the choice that they really want. It's just slightly less convenient, and it's purely playing with psychology. Again, these things can be used against you quite easily. And I do like to say that in general, behavioral economics as a profession at large is what you'd call sort of occupational propaganda, because you're talking about moving things around in order to get people to get to a certain point, much like propaganda is encourage you to think in a certain way or to buy into a certain idea. And that's what it really is. But those tools, even words like propaganda, have negative connotations, but they also have useful connotations. If you're trying to get people to wear seatbelts instead of dying in car crashes, those sorts of levers are quite benign policy levels. However, that term of like libertarian paternalism or nudging is being increasingly abused in the popular press and by politicians and by advertisers and marketers and even professionals in the behavioral economic space to start to refer to actually changing not just the choice architecture, but actually the choice outcome. In other words, when you're coming back to that analogy of the knickknacks and the apple, if you are giving people a gold star or a 5 Rand coin if they take the apple, and you are giving them a kick in the shins if they take the knickknacks, that's no longer libertarian paternalism or nudging or question of framing. Rather, now you've simply changed the offer on the table. And now we're into the world of coercion, right? So either bribing on the one hand, if you like to incentivize a particular outcome or a particular choice, or you are sort of tipping the scales in the other direction. So if people are being punished or rewarded for making a particular choice, if their outcome utility is different, we're no longer talking about nudging at all. We're talking about classic policy. We're talking about reward and punishment. I think any conversation about this has to be quite honest about what we're actually talking about. And almost all policies that I see these days pitched as being nudges are not nudges at all. They're just offer manipulation. So if your insurance company is giving you a discount on your premiums if you wear a particular Fitbit and run in a particular direction, they're not nudging you. They're giving you a straight up shove. They have changed the offer in order to get you to do something. So that would be my sort of overall perspective on the world of nudging. And I think that anything that involves coercion, if it is done on a sort of corporate basis, I mean, brands and advertisers have been doing this since the first days of humanity. We want people to buy into whatever it is we're selling. Of course, we give them the offer that's going to maximize both our utility and the utility of our customer, sort of fair game. But when you get into the realm of politicians kind of using your own money to bribe and or punish you, we have a very different conversations. And I think particularly when those bribes and shoves and blackmails and all the rest of it are being used to incentivize or to coerce people to do things that are not good for themselves, that would be good for the greater good. I think that's probably the ethical line, right? So if you're nudging people to do things that benefit them as individuals, it's probably more benign. But if you are nudging people to do things that actually harm themselves in order to preference the group, we're into a very different conversation there. And there, I think that should not be the place of a benevolent government. But I'm sure there's many people that would disagree with me there. But that's at least the distinctions the way I look at these things and what's going on there. Does it benefit the individual? And is it a nudge or is it a flat out shove?
Yeah, I think it's also very important to realize that, who is setting that policy? Is it a politician or an unelected bureaucrat, for example, who might not necessarily have your best interests at heart, might be serving another kind of agenda? And I think it's very interesting just to reflect on the behavioral economics literature. I mean, I think a book that I found quite interesting was Thinking Fast and Slow by the founders of the discipline, Tversky and Kahneman. And, I think that's very useful to reflect on your own biases and your own blind spots and the heuristics that we develop in order to make decisions, and how our decisions are not always perfectly rational. But I think that's maybe on the individual level, but if you extend that out to forming policy, I think that then becomes quite dangerous, as you've alluded to.
Yeah, it's essentially designed to sort of hack humans, right? To override our biases, but wholesale. And of course, with most of these things, you get quite quickly into the questions as to whether they were actually good for society after all or not. And the other thing that I think a lot of policymakers miss with the behavioral economics heuristics and trying to hack them is that heuristics are which are basically like rules of thumb, like what your body defaults to or what your brain defaults to when it's sort of running on autopilot. They work more times than not. And in fact, they were an evolutionary advantage for like humanity, right? That's the whole point of a heuristic. And that's when you start getting into mental models and the whole sort of psychology around that a lot of sort of the pop talking heads like to talk about. Spend a lot of time talking about how to override heuristics, right? But that's not necessarily an efficient strategy for individuals or for herds, because quite frankly, the baseline heuristic, even if it's only right marginally more than half the time, it still saves you a lot of time. And I think a lot of people get stuck into the ability or the trying to interrogate mental models, go down that self-improvement path and try to say, how do we override this heuristic here? And how do I interrogate that? But this comes back to what we sort of opened with today, this overwhelming choice that we have, which is why we actually defer agency on the big decisions, because we feel overwhelmed about choice on the small decisions, because we are over analyzing our natural bias on the very simple choices as to what to have for lunch, right? Like, am I choosing this because it's a heuristic, or am I choosing it because something else? And if you overthink these sorts of things, you can actually waste an awful lot of your life with very marginal returns to the extra effort that you put into your choice making and your decision making ability. But that's all that said. there is space. I think it's only fair to say that policymakers do take advantage of that when people are consistently making bad choices. And I think there's very good examples to be said around, automating opt-in as opposed to opt-outs on things like organ donation or on things like, what pension funds you get into. But even so, we should be aware of the fact that different people make different choices for different reasons. And that if we are even making the most benign nudges towards, say, getting people to opt into a government mandated pension plan, for example, that's perhaps quite high on a particular class of equities, by nudging everyone in the same direction, instead of allowing the group to make various decisions, some of whom would make better and some of whom would make worse if left unnudged towards what seems to be preferred direction, we could actually set ourselves up for greater pain as a collective if the nudge choice ends up being the wrong choice, which is why I do think that there's a lot to be said about variance and about grayness. And that comes back to the earlier points you're making around trust in machines, which do tend to flatten a whole lot of nuance towards a consensus of sort. And consensus can be dangerous if consensus ends up being wrong. So I think a lot of these sort of conversations come together. I think the bottom line is policy making is really, really difficult. And that's why in general, when in doubt, doing nothing is quite often the best choice of action.
And Bronwyn, I mean, you spoke about the perils of consensus. One of the points of consensus that we're surrounded by is this idea that we're facing an imminent environmental catastrophe and we have to go towards more sustainable solutions. I've seen you comment in the past about that particular question. What are some of your reflections on that? Because it also seems that there's a kind of a technological utopianism to that as well, that if we just get the right mix of solar panels and windmills, then we'll kind of reach this nirvana of this environmentally sustainable era. What are your thoughts on that topic?
That topic, I think, is quite an interesting one because there's many questions there and they tend to get conflated. There's the conflation about what is and what ought to happen now. Like we're dealing with a messy plate at the moment. You're in the middle of a particular situation that's, whether you are personally responsible for causing that situation or not is it's entirely irrelevant. The point is you are here right now, the weather and the climate are doing X, Y, Z, and that's the situation we have right now. Unfortunately, a lot of the conversation around trying to deal with where we are right now in terms of climate and pollution and all the rest of it are talking about what we ought to do, but quite often those conversations about what we ought to do are not necessarily fully realistic about where we are right now. Now, you can't actually make good instrumental choices, and a good instrumental choice is a choice that you make that gets you to where you want to be. That's then you have achieved at being instrumentally correct. But it's very hard to do that unless you are empirically correct about the problem that you are actually facing. Not the problem you want to have, not the world you would like to be living in, but the actual reality about where you are right now and what your choice constraints really are. And unfortunately, a lot of the conversations about what to do with climate crisis and all the rest of it seem to be a little bit misled about the actual reality about the constraint, the choice constraint that we're actually facing now. A lot of the conversations seem to gloss over a lot of the costs of the preferred solutions, and a lot of the preferred solutions on the table have a lot of unseen effects that could actually end up undoing a lot of the things that we want to do. The point is, when it comes to climate, much like with economy, and more so with climate, because we understand less about it because climate was here first, quite frankly, and whereas the economy is something we both made and broken all by ourselves, right? We made that up as we kind of went along. But climate, a lot of those systems, we don't even fully understand yet. And if we have broken those systems, if we have manipulated them, there is absolutely no way that we fully understand how we've manipulated them. And worse than that, we're not quite sure if our so-called fixes are going to make things worse. I think my favorite example there are the increasing calls by very rich and very powerful people for us to actually get involved with putting certain gases into our atmosphere to deflect sunlight. In other words, to reduce the amounts of sunlight that comes onto our planet so we can actually start to cool the planet.
What could go wrong?
what could possibly go wrong with like actual climate engineering, right? So it's been done by people with good intentions, saying, okay, we've made the planet too hot, now we need to turn the knob down, but it doesn't work that way. The planet isn't like a heater that you can switch on and switch off, and now we turned it up too high so we can just turn it a few degrees down. We don't understand the way climate systems work. We can't even predict the weather. I mean, just open the weather app on your phone that told me it was going to be raining right now and the sun is shining right there outside. Chaos theory tells us that a very small measurement error can have vast complications going forward. And radical ideas like putting up, sun shields or spraying extra sort of gases into the sky in order to deflect the climate and to engineer weather here or rain there or drought here, whatever the case is, are hugely dangerous, because we think we have such hubris to think that we can mess around in a system that we already messed up, and that our new messing up is not going to have unintended consequences. And already we don't even fully understand, like the climate conversation was all about global warming until quite recently, and now it's more about climate change. We understand that it's not purely a one direction. We don't even understand what the changes we have made are actually going to do in the long run. And we're getting better at identifying these things, but we certainly don't know everything yet. And it's quite difficult when you start messing around with complicated systems, changing knobs that you don't fully understand what their long run impacts are going to be, and not understanding that we've already twiddled with other knobs over here, and that a lot of those causes and effects are still going to roll out. So a lot of our sort of responses tend to be too grand, although we are facing grand challenges and no denying that at all. We have to think very carefully about the interventions we're going to make now. They're not going to have unintended consequences and make things worse. And this is something we've done many times, over and over and over again, in terms of human history, from putting the rabbits into Australia and then bringing into the other animals to eat the rabbits, to bring, and on like the lady who swallowed the fly and ended up dying after eating a horse. The whole story, it does seem to remind me of that. That's the one challenge with the sort of the climate conversation at the moment. And the other one is the huge unfairness of the solutions being proposed. And it's a particularly unfair crisis, much like COVID was a very unfair crisis, in that the continent that's going to be most affected by climate change is going to be Africa, and the continent that can least afford the climate solution package that is being sort of proposed in terms of degrowth, in terms of reducing production, in terms of reducing industrialization, in terms of all those reductions, is Africa too. So it's a very unfair crisis. And that's a much more sort of practical conversation, much more sort of theoretical one about like, are we actually making the right choices here? Are we just making other problems? And both those conversations have to be had, and none of them have easy answers. The unintended consequences conversations go on in many directions, even down to sort of like, how are we going to pay for the bits that go into our renewable fuel cells, for example? And there's so many unknowns. It's a very chaotic problem that we have created. And I think that my general advice would be that we shouldn't be too seduced by simple sounding solutions for such messy problems. And we also have to be kind about the people who are going to be carrying the cost of whatever solutions are chosen, because there will be people that are going to be left materially worse off, and there are people that are going to be made materially better off from applying whatever the chosen solutions are going forward. And I would always encourage people to interrogate perhaps the financial incentives involved with the decision makers who are choosing which solutions to adopt and which ones perhaps to overlook. And of course, the classic conversation there would be the conversations around nuclear, which has become like a particularly like a moral issue among many people. It seems to be negating a lot of the science, but if you follow the money, you can usually unravel a lot of these stories. Just understand why certain groups of people have preference for certain solutions, and quite often that preference is financially driven rather than actually solution driven. So that's a lot of words to say that, yeah, the green issue is messy, but the incentives are all wrong, and the unintended consequences could be vast.
Yeah, I think that term hubris that you use is a very good one. I think the conceit of human action, that we can perfectly design the world to our intended end, I think is responsible for many of the biggest mistakes in history.
Like conversations around a lot of government policy too, right? So government policy messed up, so let's give government more power so they can fix up the mess that they made by us deferring our agency and our choice to them. It's these things are very fractal, like I keep on saying. Like it's like the mistakes we make on the micro level are the same mistakes we make on a macro level. This constant sort of inability for us to learn from history that doing more of the same thing won't get us better results.
I like the quote from Hayek, who said that the curious task of economics is to demonstrate to man how little he knows about what he thinks he can design.
Absolutely. But I think on the climate side, the stakes are just so much higher. The stakes of messing it up. Like the economy is important and it has real impacts on real people's lives. But still, it's just money at the end of the day. Like if we look at it from a very sort of high level perspective, whereas the stakes involved in messing up our response to the climate crisis are existential, quite frankly. I mean, if we put too much of a particular sun-blocking gas into the sky and we cause an inadvertent, basically nuclear winter in our attempts to fix the mistakes we made 100 years ago, that's a much bigger problem. And nothing sort of focuses the mind like our mortality. But let us not use fear to sort of drive us into making short-term choices that could have very bad real effects, even with very well-intended policy. And we know these conversations from the world of economics and politics. We know that a lot of the worst evil done at a policy level or at a central planning level has been done by people who believed that they had good intentions. Not all of them. There are bad people as well as stupid people in power. But a lot of choices have been made by people who thought they were doing the right thing, but just didn't simply understand the incentives that they were creating and didn't understand the impacts and the long run effects and the basic laws of nature, the basic laws of supply and demand and up and down and force that begets a force in the opposite direction.
Yeah, and sometimes there's a lot of face saving that happens. So a policy will be introduced
and then back to the biases, right? Politicians have biases too, right? Politicians have all those heuristics too. They have those sunk cost fallacies. We double down on bad decisions because we want to save face.
Yeah, and I think that's perhaps a good segue into one of your talking points, which is modern monetary theory, which I think I've seen you call a magic money tree. So I think a policy decision was taken in the wake of the global financial crisis. As I mentioned earlier, to vastly inflate the money supply. And now we're seeing inflationary effects, which is being dismissed as purely transitory. What is your take on modern monetary theory? What are some of the downsides of it?
I've taken to calling it postmodern monetary theory because it comes back to also what we were speaking about earlier, this concept of just undermining actual reality and replacing objectivity with subjectivity. And you get to sort of like this unfalsifiable place, which is basically the point of we beyond science here, we're way beyond science. But it's worth bearing in mind that economics, as I said earlier, is software. It's made up, like it's made up by people. We kind of make up the rules. We can't make up the effects of the rules that we choose to break or change and the real punishment that people will take in the real world, but we can play around with money. We can do very strange things with it. We can print $1 trillion coins and force people to believe in them, whether that's through very clever propaganda campaigns or whether that's through simply showing up at your country with a bunch of tanks and saying, give us your oil, right? I mean, like we can enforce a lot of our mythology if we're smart enough. And I think that's probably the uncomfortable thing when it comes to money, is that most of these crazy ideas do work as long as you can get enough people to believe in them. And that's the wonderfulness of human nature and how absolutely strange we are as creatures at the software level. But that's the real disconnect. At the hardware level, the real world does actually respond to real laws, like there's forces of gravity and what goes up does tend to go down. And the real problem with ideas like modern monetary theory, and let's be clear, anyone that is a proponent of the theory will say that real modern monetary theory has never been tried, and that's not what we had over the last couple of years. Nonetheless, in general, inflationary monetary policy is, just like a lot of the incentives that are being put in place for the climate change conversation, beneficial to certain players in the game, because any software in the economic layer of the universe that we have that messes around with the rules but cannot actually change the reality is in fact basically redistributionary. That's what any changes to monetary supply really is. Changes to monetary supply is like changing the rules in the game, but not changing the number of balls on the pitch, not changing the number of players on the field or the prizes that can be won at the end of that game, but it's changing the rules. It's giving advantage to some players at the expense of the other, because that's the way advantage works. It's relative. It's not absolute. So any inflationary or even deflationary monetary policy that changes the quantity or the speed with which money moves itself through the economy changes the winners and gives some certain players a certain edge. And that's the unfortunate thing. And it's just like, it's the basic thing of whoever gets the first drink at the tap of that new money has an outside advantage over everyone else, because prices are sticky and the real world takes time to respond to that. And there's an awful lot of goodies you can scoop into your trolley in your trolley dash with your new free money before everyone else is able to actually respond to that, or even sometimes to notice what's going on. I think this is what's really surprised me with any conversations around the record-breaking increase in the US money supply. In fact, I think I was looking like the M2 supply, the amount they increased it in 2020 was equivalent to 5% of the world's GDP for that year. That's quite significant on like a global level. And that's one country. Like that's enough to change quite a lot of the resource distribution in the real hardware layer of the world. And I think what's quite frustrating for that from a weaker currencies that don't have quite so many big men in sort of camo outfits and tanks that can sort of force other people to believe in or to take your newly printed advantage, that a lot of that inflationary advantage didn't just go to sort of preferred players in the US's domestic currency. It also gave the US as a whole an unfair advantage over the rest of the world, because no country at the moment, I mean, like even North Korea still has some things that come and go across its borders, even if it's not officially so. No country is an island anymore. Our global economy is globally connected. And that means that the US's printed advantage in terms of the money supply that it's increased can be used to buy real assets for countries like South Africa. Like, you know, if the US prints $4 or $5 trillion, they can buy $4 or $5 trillion worth of goods before prices change, right? Like that's exactly what happened. A lot of it went to individuals that use it to buy stocks, which is why we saw stock prices increase so much. I'm not going to go into the whole sort of cause and effect, because the whole economy is connected. It's very, very messy, very, very quickly. But the point is that a lot of wealth has been transferred from the weak towards the strong. I think that's a useful conversation to have around this topic, because quite often when we think about things like inflation or things like modern monetary theory and quantitative easing, whatever you want to call it, changing the rules of the game in order to redistribute, which is usually framed as redistribution from poor or from rich towards the poor, which is why quite often inflationary monetary policy is seen as quite progressive by certain spheres of the political class. But what is not often mentioned is that even if that is actually the effect, if the effect of local inflation is to essentially tax the rich at the expense of the poor, even if that does happen, and that doesn't happen in practice because inflation is often quite regressive too, but some proponents of inflation, particularly modern monetary theory inflation, which talks about not only increasing money supply, but also distributing it to poorer people and away from wealthier people. So let's give it the benefit of the doubt and say that actually plays out the way the theory at least supposes it will. At a local level, that redistribution in theory could be slightly progressive, but at an international level, you are quite often having richer countries exploiting poorer countries. So you're not expropriating the land, the virtual land of the rich to give to the poor, so much as you are expropriating, very similar to the way colonization worked, you're expropriating the real assets of poorer economies for the benefits of wealthier economies, which is a point that people like to complain at me for mentioning all the time, but I'm happy to talk about it in detail if anyone wants to come and find me. But anyway, inflation moves things around, changes the rules of the game, and makes some people richer in comparison to others. And that's basically what it does.
So Bronwyn, as we bring this conversation to a close, one of the themes of the podcast is trying to empower individuals to navigate some of this uncertainty that we're seeing in the world today. So how would you recommend people go about reasserting their individual agency in the face of some of these technological and political and economic trends that are kind of happening up here at the macro level?
Well, I think to sort of thread all these conversations that we've had today together. I think the key to retaining any sort of semblance of your agency is not to give away the agency you still have, not to defer it to central authorities, be they human or be they code, and to really interrogate why we are giving up trust in individual human beings, including ourselves, and when that is a good idea and when that is actually not a good idea. Because the more trust we put into technology and into networks and into immutable sources, the less agency we have in order to override those decisions. Because as we all know, any technology we don't fully understand is not very distinguishable from what magic is, right? And I would encourage us not to believe in things just because they are said to be true, and to rather believe the evidence of your own eyes, and to trust yourself. Trust starts actually with trusting your own decision-making ability, and rather defer to yourself rather than to a piece of code, which was, let's be honest, programmed by human hands. And even if those human hands have defined consensus, that doesn't mean that they are right. There are many things that we have consensus on that are completely fundamentally wrong, and history is littered with examples of that. So I would encourage you to trust yourself rather than trusting really any piece of code as a first point of call. It might seem quite small, but it's probably going to become a very revolutionary act as technology from both a demand and the supply side is going to be eroding more and more onto your agency, or tempting you to give away more and more of your agency as you go forward.
Bronwyn Williams, thank you very much for joining me on Solutions with David Ansara. I feel that I'm a very empowered individual after this conversation, and hopefully my listeners are as well. But just wanted to thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. Hopefully that wasn't too crazy a ride.
If you enjoyed this conversation and you're watching on YouTube, please do give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Also leave your thoughts in the comment section below. And if you're listening on your preferred podcast platform, please do subscribe there as well. And just a quick reminder that I have launched a personal newsletter that goes out every Saturday morning. I mostly reflect on my reading and also some of these podcast episodes. My name is David Ansara. Until next Sunday, take care.